Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about collections, arrays, and dictionaries. And based on what we just learned about persistent and non-persistent storage, this is going to come in handy here to talk about essentially collections, arrays, and dictionaries. So if we look at collections, arrays, and dictionaries, these are all just forms of non-persistent storage. This is storage that is in the computer's memory. It's volatile. It's only temporary. Now, that being said, programmatically, you can write the information off to a database. You can transport it out and send it to another computer over the internet or on the network. But in and of itself, the objects, collections, arrays, and dictionaries, they're just temporary. Until you do something with it, the data just lives there. When the session's over, the power goes off, whatever, the data, any data that's in these objects are going to be completely destroyed. So keep that in mind. All right, so we talked about all of that information right there. And so, okay, yeah. So these lists, again, are temporary. Obviously, they're used to process items, perform an action, run comparison, or track changes. Things that you might use a collection for is you read information from a database, but you store it off in a collection. And as the information is being used by the user in the system, they're making changes not to the back-end database, but they're making the data changes in the collection. And at some point, they may want to write the information back to the database, so you'll run a comparison about what's exactly changed and update those records and or field values based on those changes. But it's a way of, making the operation for the computer happen much more efficiently. Anyway, this is way more advanced than you need to know. Don't be scared, especially if you're just starting off. You don't necessarily need to know all of that until you maybe get into some of these advanced things. But for the most part, low code, no code should just be very simply done where you just know a little bit about these topics, learn a little bit of the syntax of what it needs to use, and it does all of the heavy lifting for it. But nonetheless, you do need to have at least a decent understanding that will come with experience. But again, this course is just to get your feet solidly on the ground so that as you start going through the documentation, you'll know what to expect. Okay, and then of course, like I said before, transport information from computer A to computer B kind of stuff. So now let's look at each of the three of these, right? Let's start off with collections. So a collection is essentially they're tables, and they have rows and columns, and they can have one or more columns, and they can have one or more records. And you've seen this earlier, right, in our other example, with the full name, first name. I should have said last name, not second name. In any event, I'm going to leave the error in there. But nonetheless, just wanted to let you see essentially what a table is and what a collection is. But keep in mind, this isn't in a spreadsheet, right? This is in memory. It's non-persistent storage. All right, so now let's start going over into arrays and dictionary. This is not so easy to understand because it doesn't necessarily lend itself to something that's easily within your experience. Arrays and dictionaries are programmatically very specific things. A collection's quite easy because you've used spreadsheets before, and so you can you have some experience in which to understand that on. So let's talk about arrays. They're similar. I'm not saying they're complicated. You can't understand it, but it takes a little bit of getting your head around this. So I'll try to do my best to explain this for you. Okay, so arrays are usually just a list, okay? So again, a list of items that you may have. And they almost always have one column. Now there is an exception, so if you are a little bit more advanced and you know what arrays are and you've seen arrays before, this course more than likely isn't for you if you know what a multi-dimensional array is, because if you know that, this course probably is well below you. But nonetheless, because you're new and you're learning, I don't want you to look back and say, I took this course and that guy didn't mention anything about it. So in any event, this is why I'm mentioning it. You don't need to understand multi-dimensional arrays. Just know that they are there. They're the exception to the rule for now. Okay, so they almost always have just the one column, again, unless they're multi-dimensional. And they also can have one or more rows, which is essentially a record. And this is where your head will probably kind of explode a little bit, but don't worry about it. It's just a simple nuance rule to remember. And in most cases, you may not even need to remember it all, except for very, very specific use cases in a low-code, no-code platform. Okay, so just like a phone book has an index, or encyclopedias have an index, and I may even be talking Greek there too, because we use Google and the internet for everything. Who uses an encyclopedia or even a phone book anymore? But books and a table of contents, okay? Maybe that's something that's a little bit more familiar. The point is there's a reference. And if you looked at anything in any textbook or anything, usually at the end of the book there's an index, and it has some sort of topic, and it has a page number that's listed, okay? So that's essentially what an index is as it relates to an array. It's the position of where this record exists inside of the list, okay? So that being said, understand that the index position always starts at 0. So the first record is a 0. The second record is position 1, and I'm going to show this to you visually, okay? So let's look at this now. Here we have some values in a list, okay? The brackets is usually the indicator. If you're ever looking at anything code-wise and you see brackets that look like this, that's a dead giveaway. You're probably dealing with an array, okay? So in this list, which is an array, you have 5 items. You have a car, a boat, a truck, a plane, and a tractor, okay? The car is at index position 0. That's the nuance. Like your normal human brain tells you, no, it's fighting with you. It's arguing, saying, I don't agree with that. The car is 1. The boat is 2. Well, yes, true, you're correct. But as far as programming and the computers are concerned and how arrays work and the way index positioning works, arrays are always what you may hear as 0 based. Okay, so it is what it is. I can't change it, okay? You just have to remember that arrays have this weird nuance, and this is the weird nuance. Anyway, it doesn't necessarily have to make sense to you. You just need to understand that it exists, and when you're dealing with it, if you get a value back from the database and you didn't expect it, like say you were trying to get the car and you put an index position of 1, right? For some reason, a low-code, no-code platform required you to use a index position to bring back a value, and all of a sudden you got back boat, but you were expecting car. Chances are you forgot that arrays are 0 based, okay? So that's why you just need to remember that because of that use case scenario. Everything kind of gets shifted off by 1 position. All right, so that is arrays. Now let's move on to dictionaries. Dictionaries are also lists, but they're a little bit different than arrays in that dictionaries are used with 2 pieces of data. One is a key and one is a value. And these key value pairs basically means that the key is like the name. Go back to variables, right? We had a name and then we had a value, okay? So the key is the variable name and the value is essentially just, well, the value. Okay, let's look at some examples of this. Okay, so the key is first name and the value is David, okay? Here is the same example, except now I have 2 records in this list. I have first name and I have last name, right? So they're not the same. Essentially, I have 2 columns because I have a first name and a last name, but I have 2 records. So if you look at this and thought about this in a table, it would essentially look like the first row or the first record would have first name and then last name would be blank. And in the second record or the second row, the first name would be blank, but the last name would be Soden. Okay, I don't know if you can visualize that. Maybe I should have made a visual for that as well. But in any event, the other item is here. Here we have essentially 1 record, but 2 columns. Okay, so this is 1 row with 2 columns, and there's a value for each one of them. Okay, because everything is contained within the curly brace. All right, so that is essentially just dictionaries. Dictionaries use these curly braces. Arrays typically use the square brackets. And a lot of this is going to lend itself to some understanding. I want you to remember arrays and dictionaries and the weird nuances of this, because we're going to get to something towards the end of this course that I'm going to refer back to this again. And I'm going to say, remember when we talked about arrays and dictionaries? Well, I'm going to talk about that towards the end. Anyway, that's it for this video. We'll see you in the next one.